In the winter of 1895, on the frozen streets of the richest city in the world, barefoot men, women, and children huddled in rags against the snow, blue with cold, and without a crumb to eat. Victorian London offered the homeless nothing but asylum and bread, and only when temperatures plummeted to zero. This was the tail end of the Little Ice Age, when canals froze solid and harsh winters gripped the 1880s and 90s with unrelenting cruelty. In cramped rooms across the city's slums, children shivered by dying fires, waiting desperately for fathers to return with money for bread. Today you will discover how the hungry battled frozen streets for scraps, how ice became currency for the desperate, and how winter's cruelest weapon, frost, became both executioner and employer. Before we move on, so if you're interested in history like this and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. The frozen Thames lay sluggish under a steel sky, its tributaries choked with ice. Along the cobblestones of the East End, frost painted intricate patterns on puddles that would not thaw for weeks. Icicles hung from tenement eaves like prison bars, and in the narrow courts and alleys where the sun never reached even at midday, snow lay trampled into gray slush that froze solid each night into treacherous, uneven sheets. This was London in the winter of 1895, a city of stark and terrible contrasts. In Belgravia and Mayfair, coal fires roared in every room. Servants carried scuttles up and down staircases, keeping drawing rooms warm enough that ladies might sit comfortably in their evening gowns. The wealthy had ice houses on their estates, brick-built chambers sunk deep into the earth where winter ice, packed in straw, would last through summer to chill champagne and preserve delicacies. Their windows glowed warm against the early darkness, curtains drawn against the cold. But turn east, toward Whitechapel, toward Bethnal Green, toward the rookeries and tenement districts, and you entered another world entirely. Here the cold was not an inconvenience, but a killer. Men stood in doorways with sacking wrapped around their feet, the only barrier between bare skin and frozen stone. Women clutched shawls that had been mended so many times they were more darn than original fabric, thin cotton offering almost no protection against winds that cut through the narrow streets like knives. Children, worst of all, wore whatever rags their parents could scavenge, layer upon layer of inadequate cloth, their fingers blue, their lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. The Little Ice Age, that long period of regional cooling across the North Atlantic, was drawing to a close. For nearly 2 centuries, winters had been severe enough to freeze the Thames solid. Londoners old enough to remember told stories of the great frost fairs, when the river became a thoroughfare, when ox were roasted on the ice and printing presses set up to commemorate the spectacle. The last frost fair had been held in 1814, more than 80 years passed before the new London Bridge and the embankments changed the river's flow, making it run faster, it deeper, less prone to freezing. Temperatures had indeed been rising steadily as the century wore on, but for those living in poverty, the winters of the 1880s and 90s remained brutal enough to kill. The cold of 1895 may not have frozen the Thames to its depths, but it froze the canals and ponds around London's outskirts, turned rain to sleet, sleet to snow, and made every breath visible as white vapor in the frigid air. Walk through Shoreditch on a January morning before dawn, and you would find bodies huddled in every sheltered corner. Some were merely sleeping, conserving what little warmth they had. Others had not survived the night. Frost killed slowly and quietly, stealing heat from those who had no reserves of fat, no warm beds, no fires to return to. The workhouse infirmaries filled with cases of frostbite, gangrene setting into blackened toes and fingers. Pneumonia swept through the crowded tenements where families of 6 or 8 shared a single room, their breath condensing on the inside of windows, freezing into patterns of ice that would not melt until spring. The cruelty of winter for the already hungry was a mathematics of suffering. A body burns more fuel trying to stay warm. A man doing heavy labor in freezing temperatures needs more food, not less. Yet winter was precisely when food became most scarce and most expensive. Vegetables rotted in frozen ground before they could be harvested. Meat prices rose. the casual labor that sustained so many construction work, street repairs, outdoor markets, all but disappeared when ice made roads impassable and mortar would not set. Wet clothes froze stiff on the body. A man who fell into water or simply sweated through heavy work and could not get dry faced death within hours if he had no fire to sit beside, no change of clothing. The poor wore their rags until they fell apart, and those rags, dampened by snow or the fog that rolled thick through London streets, conducted cold directly to the skin. Yet even in this frozen hell, there was bitter irony. The same frost that killed also created opportunity. Those vast sheets of ice forming on ponds and reservoirs in Hampstead, Highgate, and Enfield represented something valuable. Ice was a commodity, essential for preserving fish, for making the ice cream and chilled drinks that the wealthy demanded even in winter. For merchants, it was profit. For the desperate poor, it was a chance to earn enough for another day's bread. And so before dawn, so when the cold was at its worst, men set out into the darkness, heading north toward the frozen ponds, armed with hooks and pickaxes, ready to battle winter itself for survival. The official policy of relief in Victorian London rested on a threshold as arbitrary as it was cruel. Only when the thermometer dropped to zero would the authorities open their asylums and distribute bread to the destitute. A man might be starving at 5 degrees, shivering at 10, but until that mercury touched the bottom mark, he was on his own. The message was clear: suffer quietly until your suffering becomes inconvenient to ignore. Asylum, when it finally came, meant the workhouse. To enter those grim institutions was to surrender more than just your freedom. Families were separated immediately upon admission. Husbands sent to the men's ward, was wives to the women's, children torn away to the children's quarters. A mother might not see her infant for days. The workhouse regime was designed to be punishing, to discourage all but the most desperate from seeking its shelter. Hard labor, thin gruel, strict silence at meals, and the constant stigma that you had failed, that your poverty was somehow your own moral failing. Many chose to freeze rather than submit. They slept in doorways, under bridges, in any corner that offered a few inches of protection from the wind. They wrapped themselves in newspaper, in sacking stolen from warehouses, in anything that might trap a bit of warmth, and they went hungry. For the poor of London in the winter of 1895, hunger was not an occasional hardship, but a constant gnawing presence that shaped every waking moment. But it was the first thought upon rising and the last before fitful sleep. Mothers calculated endlessly, dividing a single loaf of stale bread among 5 mouths, knowing that none would have enough. A halfpenny saved from one day might buy a cup of milk the next, or it might go toward a bundle of firewood, and the choice between feeding a child and keeping that child warm was no choice at all. What did the poor eat when they could eat? Stale bread, certainly, sold cheap at the day's end by bakers eager to clear their shelves. Bread so hard it had to be soaked in water or weak tea before it could be chewed. Scraps scavenged from the markets, vegetables too bruised or rotten to sell, but not yet entirely inedible. Women fought over discarded cabbage leaves in the gutters of Covent Garden, stuffing them into aprons to carry home for soup that would be mostly water. Children gathered outside bakeries, hands outstretched, hoping for a crust, anything to quiet the ache in their bellies. Street vendors sold cheap pies of mysterious composition, meat that might have been horse, might have been cat, might have been nothing recognizable at all. No one asked too many questions when a pie cost a penny and your stomach was empty. Frozen potatoes, black with frost damage, sold for next to nothing because they were nearly worthless, fit only for the desperately hungry who would boil them to mush and eat them anyway. Charitable soup kitchens opened their doors in the worst of winter, dispensed by churches and reform societies. Long queues formed before dawn, hundreds of people standing in the cold for hours, you waiting for a bowl of thin broth and perhaps a slice of bread. The kitchens could not feed everyone. They ran out, turned people away. The lucky ones who got inside found watery soup, more turnip than meat, but warm at least, and free. The mathematics of starvation were simple and unforgiving. A man doing heavy labor burns perhaps 3,000 calories in a day. A woman, somewhat less. Children, according to their size. But what was available to the poor of the East End? A pound of bread, if they could afford it, gave perhaps 1,200 calories. A few ounces of margarine, cheap and unpleasant, added a few hundred more. Tea with a spoonful of sugar. Perhaps some porridge, oats being cheaper than wheat. Even in the best circumstances, the poor were slowly starving, or their bodies consuming their own muscle and fat to make up the deficit. In the worst circumstances, in deepest winter when work disappeared and prices rose, the deficit became a chasm. Families ate once a day, if that. Children's growth stunted. Adults grew gaunt, their teeth loose from scurvy, their joints aching from malnutrition. Hunger made people weak, and weakness made them vulnerable to the cold, and the cold made them need more food, a vicious spiral from which there was often no escape. Desperation drove people to measures that would have been unthinkable in better times. Horse fodder, oats, and bran meant for stables found its way into human cooking pots. Dump heaps were picked over for anything remotely edible. Bones already boiled for soup were boiled again and again until they yielded nothing but the memory of nutrition. And through it all, the question repeated endlessly in tenement rooms across the frozen city. What will we eat tomorrow? How will we survive another day? Long before dawn, when the stars still glittered hard and cold in the black sky, men rose from their beds in the tenements of East London. They had perhaps slept 3 or 4 hours, huddled under thin coverlets, and now they dressed in darkness, pulling on layers of ragged clothes, wrapping their throats in torn comforters, preparing for the journey north. By 5 o'clock, sometimes earlier, they were on the roads leading out of the city, trudging toward Highgate, Hampstead, Enfield, wherever the ponds lay frozen and waiting. The roads were alive with ice-getters, all moving in the same direction, their breath clouding white in the frigid air. Some rode in carts pulled by gaunt horses, in ribcage visible beneath mangy coats, creatures as poverty-stricken as their owners. Others pushed barrows, the wooden wheels creaking over frozen ruts. Many had nothing at all but their feet and their tools, a homemade iron hook lashed to a pole, a pickaxe slung over one shoulder. Among the barrowmen, partnerships formed out of necessity. Jack would give Bill a ride to the ponds, Bill sitting atop the empty barrow to spare his legs the walk. On the return journey, laden with ice, Bill would take the shafts while Jack rested. It was a fair arrangement, and fairness mattered when survival was measured in such small increments. They reached the ponds around 7, just as the first gray light began to seep into the eastern sky. But they were not the first to arrive. The poorest workers, those with neither cart nor barrow, one were already there, standing knee-deep in the deadly cold water at the pond's edge. These men had nothing to sell but their labor. They broke the ice with pickaxes, smashing it into pieces small enough to handle, hooking the chunks with their poles, and dragging them to shore. Icicles hung from the fringe of their ragged trousers, rolled up past their knees to keep them dry, though dry was a relative term. Their hands were purple, their noses blue above the ridge of scarves wrapped around their faces. For this work, breaking and packing ice into the carts of better-off men, they earned 4d per load. It was enough for bread, perhaps, if they worked quickly, if they could pack enough loads before their bodies gave out from the cold. The cart owners needed them. Time mattered desperately. The sooner a cart was loaded, the sooner it could reach the ice wells in the city, where merchants waited with ready money. Every minute counted when children sat at home, hungry, waiting for father to return with breakfast. The work was brutal. The ice had to be shattered, great sheets of it, thick enough to bear a man's weight. Pickaxes rose and fell, the sound echoing across the frozen landscape. When a section broke free, men waded into the water to retrieve it, plashing and dabbling in water so cold it burned like fire. Their clothes froze stiff within minutes. Wet fabric conducted the cold directly to skin, stealing heat faster than the body could generate it. Frostbite was common, illness inevitable, but there was no choice. The ice was growing, King Frost was baking his crop beautifully, and poor men had to harvest it or starve. There was a grim satisfaction in the work, a dark irony that men shivering in their beds the night before could find comfort in the sound of snowflakes hitting their windows. More snow meant more ice. More ice meant more work. The very thing that threatened to kill them also offered the chance to live another day. They listened to the wind spinning the chimney cowls and muttered to themselves, "There's comfort in that." Cold comfort, but comfort nonetheless. The ice is baking beautifully. And so they worked through the freezing morning, racing against time and other crews, filling cart after cart with blocks of frozen water that would be sold for profit they would never see, earning just enough to buy bread, to feed their families, to survive until the next freeze, the next harvest, the next desperate gamble against winter's cruelty. The ice well on Caledonian Road, just beside the new cattle market, looked unremarkable from the outside. A windowless brick roundhouse, squat and functional, with some sort of machinery perched atop its roof that resembled nothing so much as a gigantic mousetrap. Passers-by might glance at it and move on, never imagining what lay beneath. But step through its doors, approach the edge, and look down into that awful chasm, and you would understand immediately why men who worked there earned every penny of their wages. 72 feet deep it plunged, the height of a Belgravian mansion measured from the cellar to the attic, 42 feet across, a terrible pit, an Arctic gulf driven straight down into the London earth. The first time you looked into it, the sight was enough to turn your hair white. On a bitter December day, with frost sharp in the air outside, the breath rising from that hole was colder still, cold as death itself, an exhalation from some frozen underworld. Down in the depths, flickering lamps cast uncertain light on the men working below. They were called levelers, and their job was to spread each incoming load of ice evenly across the floor of the well, shoveling and packing as cart after cart dumped its cargo from above. They worked in awfully imminent peril, those poor fellows, struggling and slipping on the shattered, spiky surface, while loads continued to shoot down from the top, crashing and clattering, sending glassy splinters flying about their purple ears. The noise was tremendous. Each new delivery of ice came thundering down the chute, exploding on impact, fragments skittering across the frozen floor. The men below dodged as best they could, but there was nowhere to go, no escape from the constant bombardment. They wore whatever warm clothes they possessed, layer upon layer, but the cold down there was beyond anything clothing could defend against. Their breath came out in great white clouds. Their fingers, even gloved, grew numb within minutes. Yet there was something surreal about the scene. One of the levelers whistled a tune lively enough to dance to, his voice echoing strangely off the ice walls. Another paused in his work, raised a beer measure to his lips, and took a long, hearty swig, then wiped perspiration from his brow. Perspiration in that frozen pit. The physical labor was so intense, the shoveling and pounding so demanding, that even in temperatures well below freezing, men worked up a sweat. But it was a strange and terrible paradox, sweating in a place where your breath froze in the air. The well could hold 3,000 tons of ice when packed full from floor to ceiling. To achieve that capacity required 7,000 loads, little and big, carted in from the ponds over the course of weeks. As the ice accumulated, it settled under its own weight, becoming one dense mass so solid that later, when the time came to extract it for sale, men would have to hack it apart with axes. The shrinkage was remarkably small, only 6 inches pulling away from the walls on all sides, despite the lack of any artificial cooling system. The well maintained itself through simple physics. Cold air, being heavier than warm, settled and stayed at the bottom. The ice itself helped regulate the temperature, keeping the interior at freezing point year-round. No steam-powered refrigeration, no complex machinery, just a deep hole in the ground and the laws of nature doing their work. The ice well at Islington was not the only one in London, but it was among the largest. Half a dozen merchants controlled the entire ice trade of the city, and their wells were scattered strategically across the northern suburbs. Each operated on the same principle: buy ice cheap from desperate men, store it efficiently, sell it dear to fishmongers and confectioners when summer came. The system was brutally effective, profitable beyond measure, and built entirely on the labor of men working in conditions that resembled nothing so much as a frozen hell, shoveling amid the shattered ice while death's cold breath rose around them. The economics of the ice trade were straightforward and staggeringly unequal. A man with a barrow, having hauled his load through miles of frozen roads, might receive 15 pence for his trouble. A man with a horse and larger cart, carrying perhaps 4 times as much, earned 8 shillings. The average, taking into account all the various conveyances from hand barrows to pair horse vans, worked out to roughly 2 shillings per load. Consider the mathematics. The great ice well at Islington held 3,000 tons when full. To fill it required 7,000 loads of varying sizes. At an average of 2 shillings per load, the total cost to the merchant was £700. £700 bought 3,000 tons of ice, carted and delivered, broken and packed by men who risked frostbite and pneumonia for pennies. Now follow that ice forward through the year. The wells were broached in May when the weather warmed and demand rose. Fishmongers needed ice to pack their catch. Confectioners required it for ice cream and chilled desserts. Wealthy households wanted it for their drinks and larders. The contract price between merchant and customer was 2 shillings per hundredweight, which worked out to £2 per ton. 3,000 tons sold at £2 per ton generated £6,000 in revenue. Subtract the £700 paid to the ice harvesters, and the gross profit stood at £5,300. One winter's harvest, a few weeks of buying ice from desperate men, returned a profit of more than 7 times the initial investment. A small number of merchants controlled this lucrative trade. Carlo Gotti, owner of the Islington Well, was known as a mighty man of ice. He farmed the New River and Regent Canal, sending out his own carts and barges to gather the local crop. But London's suburban ponds could not supply enough ice to meet the city's growing demand. Gotti owned ships that traded constantly with Norway, bringing back what was called pure black ice, clearer and denser than the rough ice harvested from English ponds, and sold at a premium of an extra shilling per hundredweight. The imported ice came from regions where winter lasted longer and froze deeper, places where ice cutting was an established industry rather than a desperate scramble for survival. Norwegian ice was a superior product, and wealthy customers paid the difference gladly. Tia never thinking about the English poor who had broken their health harvesting inferior ice for a fraction of the price. The ice season ran from May through the end of July. By August, even the deepest wells were emptied, their contents sold and consumed. Then the cycle began again, waiting for winter, waiting for frost, waiting for King Frost to grow another crop that poor men could harvest and rich men could sell. The bitter irony was impossible to ignore. Men stood knee-deep in water so cold it could kill them, breaking ice with frozen hands, earning 4 pence for back-breaking labor. That same ice, once stored and sold, generated profits counted in thousands of pounds. The poor risked death by cold to provide luxury cooling for the wealthy. They earned barely enough for bread while merchants bought houses and expanded their fleets. The ice harvesters were essential to the trade, yet utterly disposable, easily replaced by the endless supply of desperate men that Victorian London's poverty ensured would always be available, always hungry, always willing to gamble their lives for another day's survival. In the tenement rooms across London's East End, children woke in the grey pre-dawn cold. They had shared beds, 2 or 3 to a mattress, if they were fortunate enough to have a mattress, huddled together under coverlets, so thin they provided almost no warmth. Their father had left hours ago, heading north to the ice ponds. Now they waited. The room was scarcely warmer than the street outside. Ice had formed on the inside of the windows overnight, intricate patterns of frost that would not melt until spring. The walls were thin, brick, or sometimes just wood and plaster, offering little barrier against the wind that found every crack and gap. A single small fire struggled in the grate, built from scraps of wood scavenged from building sites or broken furniture, anything that would burn. The children gathered around it, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, layered one atop another. Their mother worked quietly, mending rags by the faint light, trying to keep her hands busy, trying not to think too hard about whether her husband would return with money for breakfast. The calculation ran through her mind unbidden. If he managed 3 loads before noon, that would be 12 pence. A loaf of bread cost 4 pence. A bit of margarine, another penny. Tea and sugar, 2 pence more. Coal, if they could afford it, sixpence for a small sack. The numbers never quite added up. There was never enough for everything they needed. The children's suffering was written on their small faces, blue fingers that they tucked under their arms for warmth, coughs that rattled in narrow chests, hunger pangs that had become so constant they were almost background noise, noticed only when they intensified. The youngest cried sometimes, too young to understand why his stomach hurt, why he was always cold. The older ones had learned silence, had learned that complaining changed nothing. Outside, in other rooms of the same building, the same scene repeated. Families waiting, women calculating, children shivering. The tenements were packed tight, sometimes 8 or 10 people in a single room sharing body heat because there was no other warmth to share. Privacy did not exist. Dignity was a luxury no one could afford. The importance of timing weighed heavily. If father was delayed at the ice well, waiting his turn because he had arrived late, or because the queue was long, breakfast would be delayed. The children would wait longer, their hunger growing more acute. If the delay stretched too long, there might be no breakfast at all, the morning merging into afternoon, the single meal of the day pushed back to evening. When finally the door opened and father returned, stamping frozen feet, ice still clinging to his trouser legs, the relief was palpable. He set coins on the table wet from his frozen pockets. 8 pence. 10 pence if it had been a good morning. Mother took the money without a word and went out to buy bread while it was still available, while the baker still had loaves. Small comforts became precious beyond measure. A warm cup held between both hands, the heat seeping into frozen fingers. A piece of bread, even stale, even dry. The brief warmth by the fire before it burned down to embers and had to be carefully banked for the next day. These moments of relief from cold and hunger were fleeting, but they were what survival looked like in the winter of 1895. One day at a time, one meal at a time, one small fire at a time. The central irony of the ice harvest was impossible to escape. The same frost that killed the poor also employed them. Winter was their executioner and their employer, death and salvation wrapped into one frozen package. They profited, if such meager earnings could be called profit, from the very force that threatened their lives daily. It was a paradox as bitter as the wind that cut through the London streets. And every man who stood knee-deep in freezing water, breaking ice with numbed hands, understood it perfectly. There was a saying among the poor of the great city, "There are always crumbs for the London sparrows." A man in health, however destitute, could always find work if he looked hard enough, if he was willing to do what others would not, if he was desperate enough to risk what needed risking. The ice harvest proved the saying true, but it also revealed its terrible cost. Yes, there was work. Yes, there were crumbs. But the sparrows froze while gathering them, and some did not survive the gathering. The physical toll on ice harvesters was severe and lasting. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes, tissue dying from exposure to cold that exceeded the body's ability to protect itself. In the workhouse infirmaries, a surgeon's amputated ruined digits from men who would never again be able to grip a pickaxe or pole. Rheumatism settled deep into joints that had been submerged too many times in freezing water, causing pain that would persist for the rest of a shortened life. Every movement became an agony, every winter worse than the last, until the body simply gave out. Pneumonia swept through the ranks of ice workers with terrible regularity. Their lungs, weakened by breathing frigid air for hours on end, by working until sweat soaked their clothes, which then froze against their skin, became vulnerable to infection. Coughs that started as minor irritations deepened into rattling, bloody affairs. Men who had survived a dozen winters succumbed in their 30s, their bodies exhausted. Their resistance worn down by the accumulated damage of cold and hunger working in terrible combination. They aged prematurely, backs permanently bent from heavy labor, faces weathered and lined beyond their years, looking 50 when they were scarcely 30. And the season was brief, cruelly so. The ice harvest lasted only as long as the freeze held, a matter of weeks, perhaps a month or two, in a particularly harsh winter. When the thaw came, when temperatures rose above freezing and the ponds turned to water once more, The work disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. The ice harvesters returned to whatever other terrible employment they could find. Dock work, if they were strong enough, street sweeping, hauling coal, anything that paid. Or they found no work at all and waited, hungry, for next winter, with some for the next opportunity to gamble their health against starvation. Victorian London stood as the richest city in the world, capital of an empire that controlled a quarter of the globe's population and resources. Yet it could not or would not provide for its poorest inhabitants except under the most extreme conditions. The contrast was grotesque and impossible to ignore once you looked closely. Wealth beyond measure existed alongside absolute destitution. Mansions with dozens of heated rooms, with servants and ice houses and every comfort imaginable, stood mere streets away from tenements where families of 8 shared a single unheated chamber, where children went barefoot in snow, where people froze to death within sight of plenty. Winter forced other desperate work upon the poor as well. When heavy snow fell, men scrambled for employment clearing the roads, shoveling until their backs gave out for a few pence per hour. Women and children sold matches on street corners, standing motionless in the cold for hours, hoping passers-by would buy. Others gathered firewood, competing with dozens of rivals for scraps from building sites and broken furniture, bundling it to sell for a penny or two. Every conceivable means of earning money, however degrading, however dangerous, was pursued because the alternative was starvation. Victorian attitudes toward poverty made the situation worse. The poor were divided into categories: deserving and undeserving, worthy and unworthy of assistance. Those who worked were considered morally superior to those who could not find work, as if employment were simply a matter of character rather than economic circumstance. The workhouse system was deliberately designed to be punishing, its conditions harsh enough to discourage all but the truly desperate, based on the widespread belief that poverty was a moral failing rather than a systemic problem. Reformers and journalists like James Greenwood worked tirelessly to expose these realities, to document the conditions that the comfortable classes preferred not to see. They descended into the slums, visited the ice wells, interviewed the workers, and published their findings in newspapers and books. But change came slowly, far too slowly for those living through the winter of 1895, those who could not wait for gradual reform. The ice harvesters embodied a grim and desperate determination. They were, in the words of one contemporary observer, picking the teeth of death in order to win an honest loaf. Whilst they took what winter offered, however dangerous, however degrading, because refusing meant watching their children starve. Return now to those frozen streets of 1895 London, and you understand what lay behind the simple luxury of ice and a drink or fish packed fresh for market. Families depended on fathers who waded knee-deep in deadly water, swinging pickaxes until their hands went numb. Men risked their lives in Arctic wells 72 feet deep, dodging falling ice for pennies while merchants counted thousands in profit. Children waited in frozen rooms, hungry, hoping father would return with bread money before the day grew too late. This winter reveals the human cost of everyday commodities, the profound inequality that allowed some to prosper while others froze. The ice harvester walking home through falling snow. Why, coins clutched in frozen fingers, achieved only a small victory against winter's cruelty, a temporary reprieve from hunger. Tomorrow the cycle would begin again. If you found this history valuable, please subscribe for more.